Hello, it's ClivePriddle, and this is The Current. Today, I'm joined by Jim Tankersley, who's the author of The Riches of This Land. Hey, Jim.
Hi, Clive. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Now, Jim, I think of you as an economic journalist, which is a kind of slightly wonky sounding construction, but you've always followed economics in your journalistic career, which has taken you from Oregon, through Ohio, through the Washington Post. I think I skipped the Chicago Tribune, and now the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, right?
That's right, yeah.
So we were very fortunate at PublicAffairs when we had a conversation with you almost immediately after the 2016 election. And we had a rather unusual arrangement where we said, you offered to say, I'm going to go find out what just happened. What's going on in the middle of working America, why a lot of people have voted for Donald Trump, which seemed like an unusual political choice. And the book is, to some extent, the fruits of that investigation.
It is.
So it's also turned into something else, didn't it? It turned into a journey into the American middle class, particularly. And this seems to be a continual theme in your reporting, and perhaps even in your personal life. I think you feel you come from the middle class background. So tell us a little bit about that, and tell us how you stepped into this conversation about what's happened to the American middle class.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think that it's actually really great to go back to that time right after Donald Trump won, and that moment of thinking about, well, what were the questions we were all asking ourselves? Unlike a lot of Americans, I had seen enough polling and talked to enough people that I thought, hey, there was a chance that Trump could pull this off. And the reason I had thought that was because you could just see the deep-rooted anxieties of a lot of working-class white people across crucial states in the country. Those were both economic anxieties, like they've been left behind by the economy for a long time, and also sort of racial and cultural anxieties. They had antipathy against immigrants in particular, but also there was sort of some deeper-rooted racial resentment that polls were picking up. And, we started this conversation about the book trying to figure out, okay, well, what's gone on with that middle class that has just sort of revolted against America's political elites and elected this outsider as president? And secondly, sort of what's going to happen to them? Donald Trump made a lot of big promises to the middle class. He was going to be the greatest thing for them ever. And we wanted to know if he could deliver. And I had this real open mind about, we went through a bunch of scenarios in that meeting that you and I had, where we talked about, well, it could go this way or it could go that way, and we're just going to have to see. But as it began to unfold, the more that I followed the data and the more that I talked to people, the more that I realized that the book was just much bigger than that. The middle class story is much bigger than Donald Trump's election. It's an important window into the middle class in America. But this is like you said, something I've been writing about for a decade and a half now, as almost a full-time job, which is just the stagnation of opportunity for a large set of Americans, not just white guys in Ohio where I used to work, but women in the Richmond, Virginia suburbs who are home health aides, and Latino immigrants across the West who have been lured to the United States by a promise of getting ahead and having a better life, and who have all struggled to find entry to the middle class in the way that the country used to deliver for them for a wide variety of people after World War II. So the more that the Trump years unfolded, and the more that it became clear that he had not radically changed things for the middle class, he had not brought back all the jobs from abroad he said he was going to, the more I just became convinced we needed to tell the full story, the bigger story of, where did the great American middle class actually come from, and how might we actually get it back, and how does Trump and his policies, and in particular the sort of myths about the middle class that he and other populist politicians have sold the country, how do those all fit in? And that's the book. That's where we ended up. I
want to ask you a question because you're very clear in the book that even if readers come to the book feeling that Trump has misled the middle class. The middle class had been misled before by many years, many generations of politicians, Democrats and Republicans alike. What was happening to the middle class was a much longer trend, as you just said, Donald Trump. But I want to ask you to deal with a completely speculative question, which is, in January of 2020, prior to the coronavirus becoming, a huge national event that had, as yet, really unforeseen, still rolling out economic consequences. So take us back to January 2020 and think about what most of those working class Americans were thinking about Trump's handling of the economy. My feeling is that most people, whether they were right or whether they were wrong, were feeling the economy was in pretty good shape. That there was growth in America, there were more jobs in America, that those jobs were reasonably well distributed, and a lot of them were in working class communities.
Yeah, no, I think all those things are true. I think it is both true that Trump did not keep his promise to bring back a specific set of outsourced manufacturing jobs and to create 4%, 5%, 6% growth. He didn't live up to any of the grandiose promises at all. But he also did oversee 3 years of expansion that came at the end of another long block of expansion that all, came together to make a pretty good economy for most Americans. And I actually use the words pretty good very intentionally there. It was pretty good. It's what you would hope for with low, unemployment. But it was not everything you could have hoped for, not by a long shot. It wasn't nearly as good, for example, for most workers as the Bill Clinton era, the mid to late 90s, or as the post-war era, which is what I call in the book kind of the golden era of the American middle class. So why was that? Well, first off, growth wasn't actually anything special. It's basically the first 3 years of growth under Trump were about the same as the first 3 years of growth under President Obama's second term. If you kind of did a Pepsi challenge with them, you wouldn't know the difference on a lot of fronts between those two economies. Second off, wages were going up faster, and I think this is really important. A huge amount of people had jobs. It was a very low unemployment rate, in part because Trump inherited a very low unemployment rate, but he brought it down even more, and so wages were going up faster, and that is really, really important. And I don't want to discount it at all. They weren't going up as fast as they had in the late 90s, but there is this sort of sense that Trump had hit upon what has been in part a recipe over time for helping people climb into the middle class, which is low unemployment, decent to strong growth, and wage growth. And he did that in part because he had a very accommodative Federal Reserve, which kept interest rates close to zero for the entire time, a big contrast with a lot of Trump's predecessors over the last 50 years. And he had a very accommodated Congress for fiscal policy. They borrowed a lot of money for tax cuts and for spending increases. And it turns out when you crank up the dials on fiscal policy and monetary policy with low unemployment right now in the sort of the way the American economy is structured, you get pretty good results. And I think that's what we were seeing. I don't think those were sustainable. I think that you can't run, politically speaking, you can't run deficits of the level that Republicans have been running for a while. And Trump was already starting to talk about spending cuts in a second term if he wins one. But set that aside, it was pretty good. And so I think it's both good to acknowledge that. Polls showed a majority of Americans rated Trump's handling of the economy well and said that they were pretty satisfied with the economy. But it's also nowhere close to what people's long-run expectations had been for what the economy could be when it's at its best. And that, I think, is a really fair metric, because Trump didn't just promise pretty good. Trump promised this revolution to restore, to make America great again, not pretty good again. And there's no objective evidence in the data that the economy was great under Donald Trump if you look at growth rates as opposed to just the levels of things like unemployment, which were in part due to what he inherited.
So one of the other maybe less data-sensitive metrics for the middle class, which you talk about in the book, is essentially the middle class dream is security. the security that you own your own home, that you can afford to feed, clothe, and educate your children, and that there is a prospect in front of them for a life that maybe is a little bit better than the one that you have yourself. So I want to ask you whether Americans now feel, again, maybe setting aside the COVID moment, which is a sort of, a real deus ex machina trauma. But do the American middle class feel secure? And in particular, is that security spread equally through the middle class?
I mean, I would say no to both those questions. I don't think the middle class feels secure at all, and I don't think it's spread evenly among Americans who do feel secure. We can look at it in data, or we can just look at it in sort of how people talk about things. But also, I don't actually think we should separate it from the COVID moment. I mean, we are now in the second once-in-a-lifetime recession of my lifetime, of the last 10 years. And those have a toll on people. You start to feel like the bottom really could drop out at any moment. And so, yes, you had a financial crisis that was disconnected with the reality most people experienced 10 years ago, and it just slammed into their lives. You had, obviously a pandemic that has hit everyone, but some more than others. And I think that both those crises exposed is that there are just a large number of Americans who do not have, built up savings, who do not have enormous amounts of home equity, who do not have, the cushion that you would hope that they could have to ride out a rough time, even just like a light, what we might even think of as just a run-of-the-mill recession, which we will almost certainly have in the next 10 years. People don't have that. Millions of people don't have that. Home ownership rates had really dropped compared to the trend they had been on in the 90s. We had just finished repairing the damage of the Great Recession. It took almost 10 years to do that, and I think that's another thing that's just really adds in people's minds is that if it takes you 10 years to get back to the same typical household income that you had before the last recession, well, those 10 years are a time when you feel like you've lost something in that span. And so that sense of insecurity is high. And to the question of who feels it, largest, it's very clear in both the data and in all your conversations with people. I mean, it is non-white America that feels it. Black Americans have far less wealth at the median. A typical Black household has far less wealth than a typical white household. That's true even when you control for things like education levels. So the Black working class has a lot less wealth than the white working class. I think the white working class has a lot of financial insecurity as well, and and so it can be difficult, I think, for Americans to both conceptualize that things are really difficult for a wide number of workers, but that they are most difficult for the Americans who we think of as being on the margins, Black, immigrant, other non-white workers.
So one of the things I've always thought about Trump is that he is just by reflex a kind of zero-sum kind of guy. If there's competition, there's got to be a winner and there's got to be a loser. And he expresses a lot of that in his politics. If China is doing well, we must be doing badly at China's expense. Same with Mexico. And it feels as though there's a little bit of that creeps into his domestic policy agenda as well. One of the things I think that is most heartening about your book, genuinely inspiring about your book, is that you have a theory here that says, in terms of the American middle class, zero-sum is not what this is about at all. There really is a way to float all the boats. So I would love to hear you just talk a little bit about that and how you think going forward, as you say, we're probably going to have to deal with a fairly ugly economic situation in 2021. How might that be a model for how to deal with it?
I think it's a huge and important point, is that the idea that one group can only win when another group loses is kind of it completely runs counter to America's experience in its history. There's certainly almost any policy is going to have winners and losers, but let's be clear from the top that for most of American history, the winners of policy were elite white men. sort of landholders at the beginning of the Republic, and now, a subset of white men who went to college, who have college degrees, really are the ones who benefit most. And the losers tend to be everyone else. But when everyone else wins, they win in concert. And I think that's just so important. And it's not a great political slogan. It's not, I'm not going to run for office on this idea, but I do actually I want policymakers to think about it, because I think it's really important. The idea is this: after World War II, we created the greatest middle class in essentially the history of capitalism in the United States. We saw huge job growth, huge income growth, and millions of people gain that security we were talking about of owning a home and a car, and being able to prepare their kids for what they really expected would be a better life than the one they were having. And that's true of sort of the white Leave It to Beaver families that is sort of the national myth of the 50s and 60s and that era. But it's also true of just a huge number of black families who started the climb toward the middle class in that time, and other non-white families. And I just think this is a really kind of crucial point. It's obviously the central point of the book, which is that boom for everyone happened because America stopped discriminating against workers who were not white men to the degree it used to.
So speak a little bit more about that. Why did America suddenly stop discriminating in the 50s? This is long before the Civil Rights era. Was it just out of necessity in the post-war years?
Well, so here's what happens. World War II happens, and a bunch. I mean, this is so often the story of progress in America. It starts with necessity, and then it builds into a movement. So the necessity of World War II is, millions of men are sent off to fight in Europe and in the Pacific, and women are drafted to fill their jobs, and they do a really good job. They enter the workforce in numbers that America has never seen. Incidentally, black women have been a huge part of the American workforce, basically throughout history. It's really white women we're talking about being drafted into the workforce during the war. Now, a lot of them go back out of the workforce once the war ends and soldiers come home, but many of them stay in, and that door opening starts to lead to more opportunities. The same is true for black men who also were getting more jobs over that time, and who were, many of whom fought and came back and got jobs. It's not that the country got suddenly less racist and sexist overnight, but by necessity, it had given them entry points to a labor market that had been largely closed. I mean, really, for most of American history, the highest skilled, highest paying occupations were just walled off to everyone except for white guys. And so that starts to crack a little bit in the decade and a half after World War II. It really starts to accelerate in the 60s with social protest, with Black Americans really started to stand up and demand more opportunity, and the civil rights movement culminates in the Civil Rights Act, which may be the most important piece of economics legislation that the United States passed in the 20th century, and that throws open a huge door of opportunity further for Black Americans. Women are gaining opportunities through it as well, and through their own protest movements, often in concert, right? And so the country, you can see how when that happens, that's good for those workers. Okay, it's great that in 1960, almost every doctor in America was a white guy. It's great for women and for Black men that in 1970 there were more opportunity for them to become doctors. But the argument of the book is that's also great for white guys. It's great for everybody, because the economy functions best when people are able to do what they're best at. So if you have a woman who should be a rocket scientist but is stuck in a secretarial pool because that's all society will allow her to do, you're not getting the most productivity you can get out of her. You're not letting her unleash her talents to the benefit of everyone. And so when America did that, we didn't solve racism and sexism. We have a long way to go. But in that progress moment after the war, up through the mid to late 70s or the early 80s, in that moment, we created enough opportunity for workers of color, for women of all races, that it lifted the entire economy. There's this seminal study that I quote in the book that says 40% of the economic growth that happens over that period is because of expanded opportunity for women and for Black men. And that's the difference between a pretty good economy and a great economy. And it's the reason we had a great economy. I think we have, as a nation, this summer, despite all of the turmoil of protests, really had a reckoning with this idea that, oh, wait, there are opportunities still denied today in America to people based on the color of their skin or on their gender. There are still, ways that Black Americans are treated that are incredibly unjust and that deserve remedy and that need it now, not like far off in the future. And so I think that to the extent that we as a country get to work quickly on ripping down those barriers and saying we really believe in equality for everybody, we're actually going to commit ourselves to it, we could see this sort of boom again that we saw after the war, because there's a lot of talented people out there that are held back. There are a lot of really talented Black Americans who cannot get a foothold in the jobs that they would be great at doing, just for all sorts of social and policy and other discriminatory reasons. And there are a lot of women who, for really complicated reasons, like the way we handle childcare in this country, for example, are just discouraged or blocked from using their talents in a way that would be absolutely most beneficial to them, to their families, and to our country. And so yeah, this sounds a little bit Pollyanna when I hear myself saying it, but all we have to do is solve institutional racism and sexism and we'll be fine. Well, that's it. That's great. That's simple. Obviously it's not. Obviously it's incredibly hard work, but I do feel heartened by the degree to which the country seems to be embracing that idea that we need to do something about those institutional forces. And it doesn't have to be a 10-point economic plan. It could just be sort of a shared national commitment to helping each other get ahead. And I really do think that will create all sorts of things that we can't even imagine right now in terms of innovation and better paying jobs and unleashed talent in the economy. I'm a human optimist. I believe that people are absolutely capable of amazing things, and that there is just a bright possible path for us to take. It'll be hard to get there, but that we really could have another era of prosperity that lifts everybody, like the post-war era again, if we set ourselves to it.
So I know that you think there's a sort of a moral urgency to that program as well, but what you're sort of saying is that economically speaking, maybe just in dry economics, the next great market opportunity is liberating all of us. And that if we can do that, given the resources here that are underused, underappreciated, not adequately connected into the national economy, if we can just use all of ourselves, that could be the source of the next big American growth phase. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely how I feel. I also think there's a ton of data that backs me up. There is absolutely a moral arc to this book, and it starts with sort of a moral question that has been bugging me since I was a kid growing up in a small town in Oregon where the timber industry had cratered, and I saw opportunity dry up for a lot of the guys I went to high school with. And it's blossomed over time as I've met and interviewed so many workers across the country, across races and backgrounds, and just seeing the ways in which the economy is not delivering for them. I mean, I do think there's this moral urgency to trying to fix that, to work for those guys I went to high school with, and families like the Greens and so many other people that I've met. But I think that, like, in dry economic terms, there's just a ton of evidence that is the great productivity opportunity that the economy is missing. I'll give you one example. If you look at how Silicon Valley dispenses venture capital right now, it is crazy. It is something like 86% of venture capital in 2018 went to companies founded exclusively by men. And only 2% went to companies exclusively founded by women. Now, we have problems in the tech pipeline. It's still, like a lot of STEM fields, struggling to defeat its own systems that hold back women even from just getting started down tech careers in college. But they've made significant progress, and the numbers should be, even if you just track sort of who's coming out of college and has good ideas, there's no way it should be like that. That is absolute evidence of discrimination sitting there right in front of us in those venture capital stats. And it's also, I just really believe, a clear evidence of a market failure, that there are women out there with great ideas who can't get the funding to create the companies that would then put people to work in innovative ways. And, anecdotally, when I talk to the small set of investors who are trying to specialize in companies run by women, they say, female founders are maybe more focused on solving big social human problems right now in the country, things like climate change or water shortages or big healthcare problems, as opposed to male founders who many of whom are also focused on those things, but a lot of whom are making kind of Uber for whatever in a way that is a small, helpful, incremental efficiency piece, but not like a big sweeping improvement. And so, I think that there's just a ton of evidence in those stats and those stories that suggests people are a great untapped resource. And it's funny, we live in a time when there is a real fear that we're all going to have our jobs replaced by robots. And certainly a lot of people have seen their jobs automated away. But in the past, when that's happened in America, when technology has rendered some jobs obsolete, what's happened is that smart, innovative people have found even better uses of the talents of the workers who were displaced. And it's that lack of that second step that is really holding America back right now, and that I think investing in people will correct.
Jim, thank you so much for doing this, and really thank you for the book. The book is terrific, and very much looking forward to seeing how it lands.
Hachette,